On December 4th, 1991, one of the most iconic brands of the 20th century ceased to exist. After 64 years of operation, Pan American World Airways, the airline that had symbolized America itself, grounded its flights forever.
This was the airline that had pioneered international travel, the first to fly jets across the Atlantic, the first to buy the Boeing 747. At its peak, its routes spanned the globe, and its logo was a passport to the world.
So how does a company at the pinnacle of global aviation, with billions in assets and a world-famous brand, collapse into nothing? What combination of factors could dismantle an institution this large? This is the story of deregulation, global politics, and an act of shocking violence that unmade a giant. The story of this empire begins with one man's colossal ambition. In 1927, a young Yale graduate named Juan Trippe took control of a tiny air service with a contract to fly mail from Key West to Havana. But Trippe didn't just want to run an airline. He wanted to create a global transportation network, an air bridge that would connect America to the world. His first great obstacle was the oceans. In an era before long-range airliners and even many international airports, Trippe's solution was legendary: the flying boat. These were the famous Pan Am Clippers. These were no ordinary planes. They were the ocean liners of the sky. On board, passengers would enjoy multi-course meals served by white-coated stewards and can even retire to sleeping berths for overnight flights. It was the height of luxury and adventure. With this fleet, Pan Am became a true pioneer. While other airlines were flying domestically, Pan Am was conquering the globe. In 1935, they established the first scheduled airline route across the vast Pacific Ocean. A few years later, they conquered the Atlantic. They weren't just participating in the market, they were inventing it. Pan Am became America's unofficial international airline, a tool of foreign policy, and a powerful symbol of American ingenuity reaching across the globe. But the age of the flying boat was coming to an end. A new technology was about to make the world even smaller, and Pan Am, once again, was at the forefront. In 1958, their brand new Boeing 707 made the first scheduled transatlantic jet flight from New York to Paris. Travel times were cut in half. The jet age had begun, and Pan Am was its undisputed king. But Juan Trippe's ambition was not satisfied. He made another bet, one so large it would define his legacy and the future of air travel. He went to Boeing with a request for a plane more than twice the size of any existing airliner. The result was the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet. Pan Am was the 747's launch customer, placing a colossal order of over $500 million, a staggering gamble that effectively forced the plane into existence and nearly bankrupted Boeing to build it. With the 747 as its flagship, Pan Am became more than an airline. It was a cultural phenomenon. It was immortalized in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey as the official airline of the future. They even created a first moon flights club, taking reservations from thousands of hopeful lunar tourists. By the late 1960s, Pan Am wasn't just in the market, they were the market, an untouchable empire of the sky. As the 1970s began, Pan Am's empire seemed invincible, its power built on a fleet of brand new Boeing 747s. But the very plane that symbolized their dominance would soon become their greatest vulnerability. In October 1973, the world was shaken by the oil crisis. An embargo by OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, sent fuel prices skyrocketing by nearly 400%, almost overnight. For an airline whose entire strategy was built on a fleet of giant 4-engine jumbo jets, the effect was catastrophic. Suddenly, their magnificent 747s were incredibly expensive to fly. Worse, the global economic shock meant fewer people were traveling. Pan Am found itself flying massive, half-empty planes across the globe. Each flight began to hemorrhage money. The golden age was officially over. For the first time in its history, the empire was bleeding. Wounded by the oil crisis, Pan Am limped through the mid-1970s, struggling with massive debt. But the next blow wouldn't come from an oil field overseas, it would come from their own government. In 1978, President Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act.
The law was designed to increase competition and lower prices for consumers by letting airlines fly wherever they wanted and charge whatever they wanted. On the surface, it sounded like fair competition. But for Pan Am, it was a dagger to the heart. And the reason was a simple historical quirk. Because Juan Trippe had originally created Pan Am as America's quote-unquote unofficial international carrier, they had never been allowed to build a domestic route network. They couldn't fly passengers from Chicago to New York. Before 1978, this was a protected, profitable system. But after deregulation, competitors like United, American, and Delta could suddenly challenge Pan Am on their lucrative London and Tokyo routes. Crucially, they could feed those international flights with passengers from their own massive domestic networks, offering cheaper package deals. Pan Am was under siege, fighting a price war with one hand tied behind its back. The empire was no longer just bleeding. It was being dismantled piece by its rivals. To survive, Pan Am made a desperate move. They bought a domestic airline, National Airlines, hoping to build a network overnight. But the merger was a disaster, plunging them even deeper into debt. Deep in debt and fighting a losing battle against its competitors, the once great airline entered the late 1980s critically weakened. But the final, most devastating blow would not be financial. It would be an act of terror. As a potent symbol of the United States, Pan Am had become a target. Throughout the decade, their planes and offices had been subjected to hijackings and bombings, a constant low-level threat. Then, on December 21st, 1988, just 4 days before Christmas, Pan Am Flight 103 took off from London, headed for New York. 38 minutes into its flight, while cruising at 31,000 feet, a bomb hidden in a cassette player in the forward cargo hold detonated. The plane disintegrated over the small Scottish town of Lockerbie. All 259 people on board, passengers and crew, were gone, along with 11 people on the ground. It was the deadliest terror attack on American civilians until 9/11. The aftermath was a final, mortal wound for Pan Am. The airline was accused of gross negligence in its security and faced hundreds of lawsuits from the victims' families, eventually paying out hundreds of millions of dollars. The American public was now afraid to fly Pan Am. Bookings plummeted. The trust, once the bedrock of their global brand, was gone forever. The Lockerbie bombing was more than a tragedy. For Pan Am, it was a mortal wound. The airline, once the very symbol of safe international travel, was now permanently associated with danger. The lawsuits mounted into the hundreds of millions and bookings plummeted. Crippled and bleeding cash, the airline entered a phase of managed decline. To pay off its massive debts, Pan Am began selling its most precious assets, the very empire Juan Trippe had spent a lifetime building. First, they sold their entire Pacific division to their rival United Airlines, giving up their historic routes to Asia. A few years later came the ultimate act of surrender. They sold their coveted, highly profitable London Heathrow routes, also to United. They were no longer an empire. They were a ghost, haunting their few remaining routes. But the world had one last blow to deliver. In August 1990, the first Gulf War began. The subsequent spike in oil prices and renewed fears of international terrorism was the final, insurmountable crisis. For the skeletal remains of Pan Am, there was nowhere left to go. In early 1991, American World Airways filed for bankruptcy. For the rest of the year, they desperately tried to restructure, but it was no use. The end had come. The emotional end came on Wednesday, December 4th, 1991. Pan Am Flight 436, a Boeing 727 named the Clipper Goodwill, was flying from Bridgetown, Barbados to Miami. It would be the airline's last ever flight. As the plane landed, Captain Mark Pyle made a final heartbreaking announcement to air traffic control, his voice cracking.
Pan Am Clipper 436 is on the ground. We're shutting down now. We're giving up the ship. Thank you, sir.
After 64 years, the empire was gone. 7,500 people lost their jobs just weeks before Christmas. So what is left of the airline that once owned the world? The name is now just a memory, a symbol of a lost golden age of travel, licensed for movies and merchandise. The iconic Pan Am building in New York now bears another name, but the true legacy is written in the skies. It was Pan Am's ambition that pioneered the routes, their gamble that created the 747, and their vision that built the world of international air travel we know today.
Pan Am flew into history, leaving behind a powerful lesson that an empire, no matter how vast or glamorous, is never too big to fail. That sometimes not even the world is enough. The future of luxury global travel they had promised was now officially unmade.